You prayed, not once, not casually. You prayed with everything you had, with faith, with persistence, with the kind of honesty before God that costs something. And nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks, then months. And somewhere in that silence, a question formed that most Christians are afraid to say out loud. Why is God not answering? Not is God listening? We covered that in our last video, and Scripture answers that with absolute clarity. But this question is different, harder, more personal. If God heard from the first day, as Daniel 10 tells us, then why does the answer sometimes take so long to arrive? Scripture does not leave this question unanswered, and what the Bible reveals about why God sometimes delays is not what most people expect. It is not punishment. It is not absence. It is not indifference. It is something far more purposeful and far more specific than any of those explanations. Stay with me through this entire video, because what Scripture reveals about delayed answers may be the most important thing you have ever been taught about how God actually works. Before we go further, I want to acknowledge something directly. This is one of the most emotionally loaded questions in the Christian life, because it is not abstract theology. It is personal. It involves real prayers, real waiting, and real pain. I am not going to minimize that. What I am going to do is take that question, exactly as it stands, with all its weight, directly to Scripture. We are going to look at specific biblical accounts of delayed answers. We are going to examine what those accounts reveal about the purposes behind the delay. And we are going to look at what Jesus himself said about waiting, because he said more about it than most people realize. Everything grounded entirely in the text. No easy answers, no false comfort. Just what the Bible actually says, which turns out to be far more honest and far more helpful than anything else on offer. Let's begin. The first thing Scripture establishes about delayed answers is something that reframes the entire question. In our last video, we looked at Daniel 10, the passage where an angel appears to Daniel after 21 days of unanswered prayer, and says, "From the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words." From the first day. The response was immediate. But the visible arrival took 21 days, and the angel gives a specific reason for the delay in verse 13. "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. There was resistance in the spiritual realm, active, sustained resistance, that delayed the visible arrival of what had already been dispatched from the first day of prayer. This is the first category of delay Scripture identifies. Not divine inattention, but spiritual resistance in the invisible realm between the prayer being heard and the answer arriving visibly. But Daniel 10 is not the only passage that addresses this, and the other passages reveal categories of delay that are even more personally significant, because they involve not spiritual warfare, but something happening specifically in the person praying, or in God's sovereign timing for something larger than the individual request. Here is the assumption that makes delayed answers so painful. Most believers, without fully realizing it, operate with a mental model that goes something like this. Prayer goes up. God decides yes or no, and the answer comes back quickly if God said yes. Under that model, delay means no. Silence means rejection. Waiting means God either did not hear or decided against it. But that model is not biblical. Scripture presents a far more complex and far more purposeful picture of how God works, one in which delay is not the absence of an answer, but often a specific and intentional part of the answer itself. Understanding this does not make the waiting easy, but it makes the waiting meaningful. And meaningful waiting is something completely different from unanswered prayer. Point 1. God delays to produce something that instant answers cannot. The first reason Scripture reveals for delayed answers is the most counterintuitive and the most transformative once you see it. God sometimes delays not in spite of his love for the person praying, but because of it. Romans 5:3-4 gives us the clearest statement of this principle in the New Testament. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. The sequence here is precise and deliberate. Suffering, which includes the suffering of unanswered prayer, produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. Paul is not describing a consolation prize for unanswered prayer. He is describing a productive process, one in which something that cannot be produced by instant answers is being formed through the experience of sustained waiting. James 1:3-4 reinforces this with equal precision. The testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Lacking in nothing. The goal Scripture describes is not simply the answered prayer. It is a person who has been formed through the process of waiting into someone who lacks nothing. Someone whose faith is not dependent on immediate results, because it has been tested and proven through sustained trust. Here is the question this raises honestly. Is it possible that the very thing you have been asking God to give you instantly is something that can only be received rightly after a process of waiting has formed you into someone capable of receiving it well? Scripture suggests that this is not just possible. For many prayers, it is exactly what is happening. Point 2. God delays because his timing serves a purpose larger than the request. The second reason Scripture reveals for delayed answers is found in one of the most emotionally raw accounts in the entire New Testament. John 11. Lazarus is sick. His sisters Mary and Martha send word to Jesus, the person they know has the power to heal. And John 11:6 records something that should stop every reader cold. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. He stayed 2 days longer, not because he did not care. John 11:5 establishes the opposite with unusual directness. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He loved them, and he waited anyway. When Jesus finally arrives, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Martha meets him with words that carry the full weight of grief and confusion. Verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She is not wrong. He could have come sooner. He chose not to. And Jesus' response reveals exactly why. Verse 4, spoken before he even left. This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. The delay was not accidental. It was purposeful. And the purpose was larger than the healing Mary and Martha had requested, because a healing would have been remarkable, but a resurrection would be something that an entirely different group of people would witness and believe because of. John 11:45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. Many believed because of what happened in the delay. Here is what this means practically. Some of the answers you have been waiting for are being delayed not because God has forgotten your request, but because he is positioning something in you, around you, or through you, that the answer, when it comes, will serve in a way that an earlier answer could not have. The delay is not the denial. Sometimes it is the setup. Point 3. What Jesus said to do in the waiting. The third thing Scripture reveals about delayed answers is what Jesus specifically instructed believers to do while waiting, and why he gave that instruction with such urgency. Luke 18:1-8, the parable of the persistent widow. Jesus tells this parable, as Luke records in verse 1, specifically to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. Not lose heart. The Greek word here, ekakeo, means to become weary, to give up, to stop because results are not coming. Jesus tells this parable because he knows that the primary casualty of delayed answers is not faith in the abstract. It is the practice of prayer itself. People stop praying because they have interpreted the delay as a no. The widow in the parable does not stop. She returns, repeatedly, persistently, not because the judge is good, Jesus explicitly says he is not, but because she does not give up her request. And Jesus ends the parable in verse 8 with a question that should arrest every person who has been waiting. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Not, will he find people who once prayed? Not, will he find people who used to believe the answer was coming? Will he find faith? Present tense, active, still praying, still expecting, still bringing the request before God despite the silence. Philippians 4:6 gives the practical application directly. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. With thanksgiving. Not with resignation, not with the defeated tone of someone who has stopped expecting. With thanksgiving, the posture of someone who trusts the character of the God they are praying to, even when the answer has not yet arrived. The instruction Scripture gives for the waiting is not silence. It is not passive endurance. It is persistent, thankful, expectant prayer, the kind that looks, from the outside, like stubbornness, but that Scripture calls faith. Now look at what these three things reveal together. God sometimes delays because the waiting is producing something in you that the instant answer could not. Endurance, character, a faith that has been tested and proven rather than assumed. God sometimes delays because his timing serves a purpose larger than the individual request, positioning people, circumstances, and outcomes in a way that the early answer would have bypassed entirely. And what Scripture instructs every believer to do in the waiting is not to interpret the silence as rejection, but to pray persistently, thankfully, and expectantly, trusting the character of a God whose delays are never accidental. Daniel waited 21 days. The answer had been dispatched from day one. Mary and Martha waited 4 days past what they thought was the deadline. The result was a resurrection that changed everything. Your waiting has a context you cannot fully see, but the God who ordained it can. So here is where I want to leave you. Think of the prayer you have been waiting on the longest, the one where the silence has been hardest, the one you have come closest to giving up on. Scripture gives you 3 honest things to hold on to in that waiting. Something is being formed in you through this process that an instant answer could not have produced. Something may be being positioned around you that the answer, when it comes, will serve in a way you cannot yet see. And the instruction of Jesus himself to the people he loved most, in the middle of their own unanswered waiting, was simply this: do not lose heart. Keep praying, keep expecting, keep bringing the request. Tonight, pray that prayer again, not with desperation, not with the defeated tone of someone who has stopped expecting, with the quiet, persistent faith of someone who has read Daniel 10, who has stood at the tomb of Lazarus, and who knows that from the first day they prayed, their words were heard. If this video brought clarity to something you have been carrying, share it with someone who is in the middle of their own waiting right now. This is exactly the kind of truth that gives people a reason to keep going. Subscribe to Beyond the Veil, because every week we go deeper into what Scripture actually says about the questions that matter most. And tell me in the comments, how long have you been waiting on the prayer that came to mind during this video? You do not have to share what it is, just tell me how long, because I want this community to know you are not alone in the waiting. And neither, according to Scripture, has God ever been absent from it. This is Beyond the Veil. What was hidden is about to become clear.